The cradle was carved in gold, but it smelled like blood. Not fresh, not warm old blood, dried into the corners, soaked into silk, lingering from the womb that bled to make him. His birth was not a beginning. It was the final gamble of a dying king who had murdered peace for an heir. The air in the palace never breathed softly again after Edward's first cry. It was the sound of victory, thin, high-pitched, trembling, a scream that promised legacy. But time would teach the world that it was a scream of mourning mistaken for triumph. They said the sun had returned to England when the boy arrived. But the sun never touched the corners of the Tudor court. The shadows moved slower, thicker, curling around tapestries embroidered with lions and lilies. The nursery was colder than the tomb, and the wet nurse whispered prayers through clenched teeth. They dressed him in royal velvet while his mother lay still beneath stone. 12 days after his birth, her warmth had already become legend, and the boy became a mirror reflecting the cracks in a father's madness, in a kingdom's illusions. Henry watched his son like a man watches a flame flicker in wind, possessive, panicked, already mourning what is still alive. He had broken gods, queens, and saints to create this child. He had rewritten scripture to secure this breath, and yet, behind every feast, every christening hymn, every proclamation of divine birthright, there was a silence. It grew louder with every cough, every fevered night, every touch of cold skin. No one said it, but all could smell it. The boy was born dying. What kind of dynasty needs a coffin built before the crown fits the brow? What kind of dream must scream itself awake? He was born beneath banners soaked in centuries of desperation, into a throne built not from legacy, but from longing. Edward, child of sacrifice, emerged as a final breath from a dying mother and a king who had turned faith into fire. He was not swaddled in innocence, but in prophecy proclaimed the savior of a bloodline cracked by ambition and stained by 6 queens. The walls of Hampton Court whispered of ghosts as the infant prince was paraded through echoing halls. Stone faces carved into archways watched him with blind judgment, ancient and cold, their mouths frozen open as if to scream warnings too late. Nurses were instructed to sleep by his door, not out of love, but fear. Every cough was a death omen. Every restless night birthed new prayers to a God who had long stopped listening. Henry, swollen with age and gout, watched from his heavy throne, eyes glossy with rot and obsession. He had torn England from Rome, burned monasteries, slit the necks of wives and enemies alike, all for this fragile, pale boy who shivered in silks too heavy for his bones. The king's gaze never softened. Even when resting upon his son, it was a gaze of possession, not affection of hunger, not hope. Edward was not a boy in his father's eyes, but a vessel, a shrine, a final monument to masculine power. But even monuments crack. The court, wrapped in layers of etiquette and dread, danced around the truth with polished shoes and poisoned words. They smiled too widely when the child waved. They bowed too low when he sneezed. Behind every curtain was a rival, and behind every rival was a prophecy of his death. No one said the prince was ill. They said he was delicate, as if delicacy could save him from worms. They blamed the rain. They blamed the cold. They blamed God's will while sharpening their knives beneath their breath. The court doctors, clad in velvet and cowardice, offered remedies of rose oil and relic dust, while the boy's lungs tightened and his hands grew thin. They painted him in portraits with apples in hand and rubies at his feet, symbols of youth and power, while his breath rasped off camera. Ambassadors wrote home of his brightness, his command of languages, his piety, never mentioning how his skin grayed in winter or how he wept when the wind howled too long. At night, when no one watched, his tutors recited prayers between lessons, not for wisdom, but for time. The palace became a reliquary of deception, gilded and solemn. Inside, Edward played the role written for him by centuries of bloodshed. He practiced his signature with a trembling hand, while his fingers curled inward like the claws of something already decaying. He smiled for bishops and bowed to men who hoped he would die. They crowned him early in every ritual, but waited to touch the real thing. His coronation robes were tailored before he could walk. His Latin decrees were drafted while his teeth were still falling out. Henry had built the throne not to hold a king, but to contain an illusion. The illusion that flesh could be ordered like armies, that lineage could be secured through ink and iron alone. But Edward's body had other plans. The boy, barely more than a whisper in a crown, moved through corridors of power with the weight of a dead empire on his spine. And the walls watched, and the dust listened. Henry VIII, growing more grotesque and swollen by the hour, took comfort not in the boy's laughter, there was none but in his obedience. Edward did not cry. He learned quickly not to. He sat silently beside his father's throne, absorbing sermons about God's will and English supremacy. Eyes wide with confusion that would later calcify into detachment. Even as a child, he understood that to breathe in this palace was not to live, but to perform. The food was abundant but tasteless. The fires were warm but never comforting. Every glance was a mirror, every gesture a test. When Henry died, the air changed. Not lighter, not heavier, just still. As if the palace itself had been holding its breath for too long and now dared not exhale. Edward was crowned before the crown had time to cool. The crown did not fit his head. It pressed into his temples like thorns, but he smiled through it. And the kingdom smiled with him. Power devoured him slowly, not in flames or poison, but in ink and breathlessness. His council governed with smiles as they hollowed him out. Every decision he signed, they whispered. Every speech he gave, they rewrote. He was a boy king with a court of old men, each one sharpening their legacy against the soft flesh of his reign. They called it guidance. But guidance, in Tudor hands, was a quiet kind of strangulation. They paraded him through cities where the people wept at the sight of him, not for joy, but fear. Not one believed he would live to see manhood, but none said so aloud. It would be treason to speak the truth, and truth in that court was more dangerous than treason. As his body weakened, his proclamations grew stronger. They issued edicts in his name against papists, against idleness, against anything that looked like softness. He was forged into a blade sharp enough to cut his own throat, and the people cheered. For a while, winter arrived like an omen. His cough became a rhythm, his skin a page upon which death slowly wrote. He stared out windows that never opened, toward gardens he would never walk. And still, the rituals continued. Still the music played. Still the court dressed in furs and faked their curtsies. He dreamed of fire. He dreamed of silence. Once, he asked his nurse if heaven had a court. She did not answer. She only wept. He never asked again. They bled him with leeches. They wrapped him in linens soaked in vinegar. They prayed louder. Nothing changed. He grew too tired to lift the quill. So others wrote in his name. They signed away lands, lives, futures, and Edward, already halfway into the grave, became a pen in a stranger's hand. There were no rebellions, only whispers, no assassinations, only sighs. He died slowly, like smoke curling from a candle never meant to burn. Long. Some say he died in prayer, others say in agony. What is known is that the scream that ended it all was not loud, not long, but sharp. One scream, final and thin, like silk torn by a blade. The palace froze. Time refused to move. No bells rang, no tears were seen, only the quiet. the same quiet that had greeted his birth, the same quiet that had haunted his father, the same quiet that now closed around the Tudor dream like a shroud. Henry VIII had imagined a golden line, strong, male, eternal. He had built it on corpses and coronations. But in the end, it ended with a child's body decaying beneath embroidered banners. There would be no sons after Edward. No more Tudors, no more golden illusions. Only silence, only legacy carved in rot. The boy who was never meant to rule. Ruled only long enough to bury the dream that made him. The scream was not his. It belonged to the dynasty. They circled him like wolves dressed in velvet, baring their fangs only when the boy's breath weakened. Edward sat upon the throne not as ruler, but as hostage, a pale figurehead held upright by trembling hands and iron wills that did not belong to him. The court pulsed with ambition disguised as piety. Beneath every bow was a blade, and behind every whispered prayer was a plan. The Lord Protector, Edward Seymour, his own uncle, moved through the halls as if the crown weighed on his own brow, not the boy's. He did not guard the child who used him, and behind Seymour stood other shadows, each darker than the last. Men whose names history glossed with ink, but whose deeds bled through the pages. The council spoke of God, of England, of duty, but it was greed that glinted in their eyes. Greed for control, for power, for survival in a court where even silence could be read as treason. They smiled at the child king while planning how to dispose of his innocence. He was made to sign death warrants before he understood the meaning of the word. He was made to watch noble blood spill in the name of his authority. The scaffold was just another extension of the throne, and Edward, young and ill, became the executioner without ever lifting a hand. Reform was the altar they built for him, and they dragged bodies across it. Catholics were hunted with greater zeal than truth. Edward's court became a theater of fire, with bishops burning at stakes while children watched. The Book of Common Prayer was printed in ink still sticky with blood. They replaced Latin with English so the people could hear their own damnation more clearly. Every change was declared godly. Every resistance branded heresy. Yet the boy behind the laws barely whispered. His voice was thin, his body thinner, and while he wasted in velvet-lined chambers, others fed on his name. They pitted Protestant against Catholic, court against court, whispering of divine providence while hiding coins in their sleeves. The Tower of London welcomed more souls than it released. And beneath it all, Edward knew. He knew he was not king. Not truly. He was parchment. He was signature. A body that could be used, so long as it still breathed. When Thomas Seymour, his other uncle, sought to twist the crown from behind the scenes, the palace cracked further. He visited the boy by night, whispering secrets, promises, lies. Edward, barely a teen, was drawn to the heat of power spoken in the dark. Thomas brought gifts, stories, touches of warmth in a life of cold protocol. But kindness from men like Seymour was a prelude to betrayal. Ambition masked as affection. He spoke against the council. He promised freedom, strength, destiny. But destiny is a mask worn by those who wish to deceive children. Eventually, Thomas was arrested, dragged through corridors he once roamed freely, accused of treason, and Edward watched it unfold from his sickbed, eyes hollow. They asked him to sign the death warrant, and he did, without tears, without hesitation. Some said it was his first true act as king. Others say it was the moment he died in spirit, if not yet in flesh. The whispers in court turned to murmurs of succession. Who would take the crown when the boy finally collapsed? The name of Mary hung in the air like incense, heavy, choking. Catholic, and Elizabeth, sharp-eyed and calculating, watched from a distance with the detachment of a ghost waiting her turn. Neither sister was trusted. Both were threats. The council moved quietly, removing those loyal to either heir, sowing new bloodlines from marriage and rumor. They floated Jane Grey like a petal atop the deathbed, a safer Protestant, a doll they could dress in monarchy. But even dolls have thorns. Edward was not unaware. Though weakened, he had the clarity of one who has been forced to look death in the eye. He knew his reign was ending. He knew his name would not echo with glory, but with decay. So he wrote his devise for the succession, a document of desperation and denial, naming Lady Jane as heir, bypassing the blood of his father, the will of the dead king, and the wrath of the daughters he feared. It was not his voice guiding the pen, but theirs, the council, the men who had poisoned one another with smiles. Edward's hand trembled as he etched history. The ink ran like blood. The page shook like flesh. But the order was clear. Mary would be denied. Elizabeth would be silenced. And Jane, cousin and pawn, would become queen. Not because Edward loved her, not because she was strong, but because she was controllable. She was the last card they could play before the scream came. For months, Edward's body faded behind thick curtains and incense. They told the people he was recovering. They told Europe he was blessed, but inside, his bed became a prison. The light hurt his eyes. The prayers hurt his head. And every breath was a betrayal of the promise his birth was supposed to fulfill. As his strength dwindled, the conspiracy solidified. Courtiers rehearsed their lies, ambassadors hedged their bets, servants eavesdropped and vanished. No one trusted anyone. The air thickened. The tapestries trembled. Death lingered in the corners, unseen but not unfelt. A boy king, stripped of boyhood and never given time to be a man, became the center of a storm that had been brewing since his father's first annulment. Henry VIII's sins did not die with him. They fermented, they echoed, they returned, shaped like laws and bloodlines, forcing Edward to wear a crown of silence, to become a relic before he was old enough to be remembered. There were attempts to save him, not of the body, but of legacy. Courtiers commissioned portraits, ordered tapestries, penned ballads. They tried to craft the myth before the corpse had cooled. They called him the English Josiah, a second Solomon. They wrote of his wisdom, his piety, his strength, ignoring the way his bones pushed through skin, the way his words slurred in fever. They painted over the rot with gold, but rot seeps. Truth waited, patient, behind locked doors and drawn curtains. The boy knew. He knew he had been used, twisted, and finally discarded. He knew his death would be more convenient than his life. The screams were not only his own, they were the screams of a kingdom tired of pretending, tired of kneeling to ghosts. On the last days, his room was filled with relics, crosses, bones, blood-washed books. The physicians argued over rituals. The bishops argued over last rites. And outside, the bells of London rang for feasts he could no longer attend. He whispered names no one could decipher. He clutched his sheets like they could hold him here. But they could not. The conspirators had moved on. Jane's dresses were already sewn. Mary's supporters were already sharpening blades. Edward's body was no longer required. Only his silence. The final breath was not majestic. It was not holy. It was not royal. It was wet, choked, and human. A sound of something small breaking in a room too grand for such frailty. And then it ended. The boy vanished into legend. But the scream lingered. The silence that followed was not peace. It was paralysis. The kind that settles not only over stone and crown, but into marrow, into memory. Edward's death was not announced with a trumpet, but with locked doors and diverted eyes. The courtiers, trained to weep for show, instead turned their faces inward and waited. They had stood too long beside a dying boy to believe in grief now. What lingered was not sorrow, it was calculation. The young king had died with a whisper, but the sound echoed through every chamber of power. Lady Jane Grey was crowned before the corpse had cooled, her voice trembling under the weight of a throne no one believed belonged to her. She wore the crown as one wears chains, and the ink of Edward's final order was still drying on parchment hidden beneath velvet pillows. Outside, the city shifted. The air thickened. The people murmured. They did not weep for the boy. They had never known him. They had only known the shadow of what he was meant to be. And when Mary Tudor rode from the east, not as a daughter but as a storm, the false calm shattered. The spell broke. They tore Edward's name from the lips of the masses with astonishing speed. The council, once so loyal in ritual, fled to corners or begged Mary's mercy. Jane, queen for 9 days, stood at the center of the machine that Edward's last breath had powered, only to be swallowed by it. And though he had written her crown into law with a trembling hand, it gave her no armor when the tide turned. Mary's procession into London was not a coronation, it was a reckoning. She did not speak Edward's name. She did not forgive. The new queen brought not just power, but fire. Edward's religious reforms, those carved from him by older men, were ripped apart in holy vengeance. Protestant books were burned. Bishops were chained. The Book of Common Prayer, once held in the boy's frail hands, was flung into pyres, its pages curling like the lungs that failed him. The England he left behind became something he would not recognize, nor would it recognize him. Edward's final legacy was contradiction. They painted him as the godly child, a savior of Protestant truth. Yet those who knew him, who sat beside him as he coughed blood into lace, remembered the fear, not the faith. The fear in his eyes when the doctors pressed too hard, when the bishops demanded too much. His reign was short, but the shadow it cast was long. It was not the legacy of policy or theology. It was the memory of a child used like a blade. The counselors who once whispered in his ears vanished into prisons or silence. His body, embalmed and buried beneath marble, did not rest among kings. It rested beneath symbols, beneath prayers written by hands that did not mourn. The tomb said Edward VI, but the walls said nothing. They had seen too much to speak again, and yet the boy's image lingered, not in flesh, but in art. Portraits commissioned by desperate men hung in dark chambers, depicting him as tall, strong, almost divine. They showed him holding the Bible like a sword, his gaze forward, unafraid. But these were fictions painted over death, carved from desire. In truth, his shoulders had slumped. His eyes had sagged. His lips had trembled with fever and the kind of sadness that cannot be spoken. Those who saw him in the final days said he spoke less and less, that his dreams turned to fire and falling, that he cried out for his mother, a ghost he never remembered but always missed, that he gripped the sheets and asked why God remained silent, and no one answered, because God, like the court, had moved on. They tore Edward's name from the lips of the masses with astonishing speed. The council, once so loyal in ritual, fled to corners or begged Mary's mercy. Jane, queen for 9 days, stood at the center of the machine that Edward's last breath had powered, only to be swallowed by it. And though he had written her crown into law with a trembling hand, it gave her no armor when the tide turned. Mary's procession into London was not a coronation. It was a reckoning. She did not speak Edward's name. She did not forgive. The new queen brought not just power, but fire. Edward's religious reforms, those carved from him by older men, were ripped apart in holy vengeance. Protestant books were burned. Bishops were chained. The Book of Common Prayer, once held in the boy's frail hands, was flung into pyres, its pages curling like the lungs that failed him. The England he left behind became something he would not recognize, nor would it recognize him. Edward's final legacy was contradiction. They painted him as the godly child, a savior of Protestant truth. Yet those who knew him, who sat beside him as he coughed blood into lace, remembered the fear, not the faith. The fear in his eyes when the doctors pressed too hard, when the bishops demanded too much. His reign was short, but the shadow it cast was long. It was not the legacy of policy or theology. It was the memory of a child used like a blade. The counselors who once whispered in his ears vanished into prisons or silence. His body, embalmed and buried beneath marble, did not rest among kings. It rested beneath symbols, beneath prayers written by hands that did not mourn. The tomb said Edward VI, but the walls said nothing. They had seen too much to speak again, and yet the boy's image lingered. Not in flesh, but in art. Portraits commissioned by desperate men hung in dark chambers, depicting him as tall, strong, almost divine. But these were fictions painted over death, carved from desire. In truth, his shoulders had slumped, his eyes had sagged, his lips had trembled with fever and the kind of sadness that cannot be spoken. Those who saw him in the final days said he spoke less and less, that his dreams turned to fire and falling, that he cried out for his mother, a ghost he never remembered but always missed, that he gripped the sheets and asked why God remained silent, and no one answered, because God, like the court, had moved on. No historian could recover the scream. It was not written, it was not recorded. It passed through velvet and flesh, through stone and sin, and was buried in air. But it lingers, in every gilded book that dares call him wise, in every church that still recites his liturgy, in every father who dreams of sons to carry a name. It is there, thin, final, cold, and unanswered. They buried him beneath the stones of Westminster, beneath a ceiling gilded with angels who never listened. The tomb bore his name, but not his truth. Marble does not remember fever. Gold does not echo screams. And prayers carved in Latin cannot mask the silence that bloomed the moment his breath stopped. The boy who had been crowned too early, wielded too cruelly, and discarded too quietly, became another relic in a kingdom built from broken promises. They wrote verses to soothe their guilt. They painted him as England's light. But light does not flicker in coffins, and no dynasty dreams in graves. He left no heirs, no war, no great reformations written by his own hand. What he left behind was emptiness, an unfinished page, a hollow throne, a scream that no one could claim. It was not a scream of fear, not even pain. It was the scream of something realizing it was never meant to survive. A body made royal, but never made ready. A breath called divine, but born to be forgotten. The scream was his only rebellion, his final truth. And long after the crown passed on, after queens rose and burned, after faith twisted again into something unrecognizable, the memory of that scream still trembled beneath stone floors. Because history may bury children, but it cannot silence the moment they break. So the dynasty ended, not with triumph, but with a sound too thin to sing, too sharp to forget. And if you listen, truly listen, you may still hear it, not in the tomb, not in the prayer, but in the silence that followed.